NASA is SpaceX's biggest customer and their biggest supporter.
So it's great. I mean, the feeling when you're addressing students is very different, and thankful to you for the opportunity. And I am, just to kind of supplement what Ipsita described about my background, just wanted to add a few things to that. Is that I came from a railway background. I worked as an officer in the government for 6 years. And as someone who has worked there for 6 years, and that too in an organization like Railways, it's a very cocooned organization. I don't know, Railways definitely, there'll be so many people who have backgrounds and relations connected to Railways. And when I did my MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, I kind of got exposed to so many new things. And post that, I joined the consulting side, and very early in my career, I advised some private sector side when they were bidding for port projects, both on both coasts of our country, or both on the eastern side of the country, both also on the western side. And there I had a chance to work with public-private partnerships, firsthand. What kind of considerations are there from the private sector side? How does a promoter take a decision when he has to bid for a project? How does the government side look at it? What is the role of a regulator there? So I worked on a 3-4 projects in the port sector, which was very interesting, very good learning experience. And then I worked with container train operators, and that is also a very different and fascinating story of what kind of things are there in the container train industry, in the railway industry, etc. So that's just something that has given me a feel about the topic that I'm going to talk about. So before I start, I will first quickly give you a brief background about Ernst & Young. Let me just share my screen. There's a presentation, but I'll just want to show only a couple of slides from that to you. So you can see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So I just want to, not go through the entire presentation, but just give you a brief so that I will not assume that everybody knows what Ernst & Young is. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes on that. So Ernst & Young is one of the big four, the acronym which is used as the big four. So the big four audit firms, which is KPMG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, and PwC. Most of these big four are known mainly for their audit practice. They have global audit practices, very reputed for that. But they also have a lot of work that they do in the other domains as well. So broadly, Ernst & Young is present in 150 countries, and it has 290,000 people all across the world. And the other thing I just wanted to share with you is that, these are all the things that Ernst & Young does. So assurance is basically the audit side of Ernst & Young. Very interestingly, in India, the regulation, which is the topic of today, says that only a chartered accountant who is registered with the ICAI can actually practice. So Ernst & Young does not do its audit business using its own name. It uses a different name. That is true for every other big four consulting firm. So that audit is a big part of Ernst & Young. Tax is also another part. So there are a lot of people who advise both on direct tax as well as on indirect tax. Both assurance and tax practice mainly has chartered accountants in them. So there is a process of articleship as well in Ernst & Young, and people rise through the ranks. There are many success stories of people who have joined in as an article and then have become a partner in Ernst & Young. So that way, I would say that it's a good place where you can, if you are hardworking, if you are talented, you will rise and become a partner. The other two are consulting and strategy and transactions. So consulting is more about the consulting side, which is on process improvements, doing some IT projects, etc. And even people-related advisory or institutional advice. And strategy and transactions is about helping either the government or the private sector in various mergers, acquisitions, transactions, bids, etc. So I belong to the strategy and transactions part of Ernst & Young, and I work mainly with the government clients, where we assist them on a lot of public-private partnership projects, and I focus a lot on the transport sector. So that is the area of focus that I have. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to tell you. This is also another quick thing that I just wanted to maybe say about the firm, Ernst & Young. It basically is a firm where, like any consulting organization, Ernst & Young is also quite flat, and everybody calls each other by name. We don't have a hierarchy. Even the person who joins on the first day will call the senior most guy by his name, because overall the intent is to pass on the brain counts. Your ability counts. It's not about hierarchy. It's about ideas. It's about what you bring to the table, and it's about how you're able to comprehend a situation and contribute to a certain project. So it's that way. I think it's a flat organization. It's all about brain work. It's all about applying your mind to different problems, and most times the output will be a report, but that report will actually capture the brand that you are having the responsibility of carrying on your shoulder, because that opinion counts for something, and that's how the entire organization works. So that's briefly about Ernst & Young. Now let me go to the presentation that I had. Yeah. So you're able to see that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So the way I thought about this was, I don't know whether I'll be able to take up all the, how much time this is going to take. I have not timed myself. But the way I wanted to do it was actually...
Rajaji, just sorry to intervene. If this session is being recorded, are you okay with it, or we just switch it off?
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, thank you.
That's fine. I don't think I have put in any sensitive data. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So so the way I thought I would do this was that to share some of the stories that I have come along in these past 20 years. As Ipsita has said, you have a certain perception in your mind on how things should work, and then the practical application of it, you actually learn from these experiences and stories. Some of them I have been personally, I have personally experienced them, and some of them are just interesting points that I thought will be good to hear for the students of TISS. So going ahead, so the on the top it says, what is the role of the regulator? And very interestingly, when you actually sit down and think about it, this is not any theory. This is just things that I have myself typed today morning, and basically for every one of them there will be a story, and then we can think about, in the context of these questions that I put in here, how did the regulator behave? How did the market participants behave? Did it conform to one of these 4 objectives or not? And of course we have great people and very learned people from TISS, and it will be great after my presentation to have that discussion and try to make sense out of this. So is the regulator's job to make services affordable for the users? Because so when I look at the telecom regulator, and generally what we perceive is that their constant focus is to see that the rates for the Indian consumer, for the mobile phone user, should be affordable, should be low. There should be competition which allows that to happen. So is that the role of the regulator? In, let us say, infrastructure asset, is the role of the regulator to ensure that there is no unfair pricing for an asset which is a monopoly. So if there is only one airport in Delhi and there is no other alternative to it, then what's the role of the regulator? Is the regulator's job to see to it that whoever is operating that asset is not fleecing the users, the airlines, the traveling public? Is that the role? Is the role of the regulator to ensure that all parties involved have a sustainable business? Or is it, so if there is a private sector entity who is actually responding to a public-private partnership project and is owning an asset, would the regulator also see whether the tariff or whatever they are recommending is something which is resulting in a sustainable business or not? Is that the role of the regulator? Is the role of the regulator to ensure that there is competition? Or sometimes does the regulator come in the way? What is the role of the regulator? So these are points that are relevant, and I think when you see real life applications, you will really keep oscillating between what is the role of the regulator, and what we have to understand is that the regulator is not something which is kind of like, for example, TRAI or any other regulator. They have been created by a legislative process, by an act of the law of the country, and that can always be changed, and whoever is making those decisions can also change the tone and tenor and the color of the regulator. So that is something that we have to understand, and whoever is in that position of deciding have always to see whether the regulator is playing the role that they're ready to are supposed to play, and is it translating in the way that they are envisaging that this sector should develop. So we'll come back to these points. Now what I'll do is that I will go through some of the anecdotes, some of the stories, some of the sectors that I have dealt with and I'm interested in, and give you some of the thoughts to ponder over. So let me start with the port sector. As I said, I started once I had quit railways after my graduation from IIM Ahmedabad. I started working in the port sector. So in the port sector in our country, there are two categories of ports. So they are called as major ports and non-major ports. So major ports are the ports which are actually controlled by the central government. So the port at JNPT, the port at Marmagao, the port at Kolkata and Haldia, the port at Chennai, the port at Tuticorin. These ports belong to the central government. So they are called major ports. And there are non-major ports which actually come under the jurisdiction of state government. So Mundra port, which is one of the largest private sector port in our country, is a non-major port. It comes under the Gujarat government. It does not come under the central government. Similarly, Krishnapatnam port in Andhra Pradesh comes under the non-major port category. Pipavav port is also something that comes under the non-major port category. So Gujarat is one state which has really used its coastline very, very well. And so all the ports which come under the state's jurisdiction are called non-major ports. So in the beginning, the major ports were handling a lot of the cargo. The export import which was happening was handled mainly by the major port, but slowly and steadily the share of the market of minor ports is also increased. Now I'm going to talk about the regulator of major ports, which is called Tariff Authority for Major Ports, and it is called TAMP in short, TAMP, and it regulates the tariffs of only the major ports. It does not regulate the tariff of the minor ports. So while there is just one slide, and I'll just talk you through it, and then I'll come back to a few anecdotes just to share how it is translated in the port sector. So in 1996, the government wanted the private sector participation to happen in ports, and they came up with some guidelines. And in 1997, the Tariff Authority of Major Ports was established as an independent regulator. And TAMP then has been issuing a series of guidelines of how the tariffs will be set. Now, many of you wouldn't know about a port, so but there's no rocket science. Ports whenever a ship comes and comes to a certain, the terminology is a berth, there's a berth hire charge. So it's very simple that for how much time the ship stays and stays against a berth, you have to pay berth hire charges. Then for cargo which has to be loaded or unloaded from a ship, there is that particular activity is called stevedoring, and there is a charge for that. So how much do you charge? Let us say if there is coal, then 1 ton of coal to load it, what is the cost? What is the charge? And to unload 1 ton of coal, what is the charge? Or if there is a container, what is the charge to remove a container from a ship, and what is the charge to place a container in a ship? So there are these charges. And then there is a charge on once the coal or the container is kept in the premises of a port, then there is a storage charge. So how much do you charge for that? So these are all various tariffs that are relevant from a port infrastructure developer perspective. So whoever is the owner or the authority of the port charges these on the shipping lines. So the ships who bring this in, or the exporter or the importer, they charge these charges on them. So the tariff authority of major ports regulates this. And in 2000, so they have been coming up with guidelines. So in 2005, they said, okay, whatever is the cost incurred, you can take a return which is of a 16% return. You can take that on the equity that you have put in, and you submit the documents to us, and we'll see that these are all fair and we will approve it. So that was the policy in 2005. In 2008, they came up with another policy. They changed the previous one, and they said that, look, before a project is bid out to the private sector, let us say that it is a terminal is given for 30 years. Then for 30 years, we want to give right now what is going to be the tariff profile. So they said that there will be a calculation which was broadly based on a 16% return as earlier, but they also put a formula saying that you don't have to come to TAMP in a regular interval to get your tariff to be revised. In the earlier construct, it was that in every 5 years or 3 years period, an entity had to go back to TAMP and say, okay, now, please revise my tariffs for the next 3 years or the next 5 years. But in 2008, they said, let's not do that because there were a lot of issues. And they said that we will link it up to the wholesale price index. So 60% of the wholesale price index, it will just get escalated. And that's a formula that we are telling you upfront. And that's how the project will run. So you don't need to keep coming back to TAMP all over again. In 2013, they again changed it. And they said that there is a bit of a tussle between major ports and minor ports, non-major ports. The non-major ports are not having any regulator. They don't fall under the jurisdiction of TAMP, and they are responsive to the market. But the major ports are under the TAMP regulation, so they are not able to respond to the market faster. So in case there is constrained capacity and there is an ability to charge higher, the tariffs are not getting revised. They are not able to benefit from that. So they some change which said that there will be some performance-linked incentives. And in 2015, they gave flexibility to major ports to fix their own tariffs. So it's very interesting. If you just kind of take a step back and think of this journey, first government formed a regulator in 1997. Then that regulator had a certain tariff policy. Then that got changed. Then they brought in performance-linked incentive, and then they completely did away with it. Very interesting if you think about it. And there were many anecdotes and stories along the way. The first anecdote is with the port in a place called Tuticorin. Tuticorin is in Chennai. It is right in the southern part of India. And Tuticorin port, they had a container terminal. So containers, the port, the terminal was handling containers, export and import containers, and basically at that time this was awarded in 1997. So TAMP had not come out with their guidelines. So at that time, the bid parameter on which Tuticorin port got it was that for every container, they will pay the authority 102 rupees. In the beginning, they will pay 102 rupees. it will keep escalating, and after 30 years it will become 5,200 rupees. That was the construct. They bid for it and they got it. But in the contract that was signed with the entity who won it, it was written that TAMP is going to get formed, and whenever TAMP comes in, you will be subject to the regulation under TAMP. This was written in the contract. So TAMP came in 1997, it got formed. So when it came, and I think in 1999, the entity there started, it is a Port of Singapore Authority, PSA. So they were the winner of that terminal, and they started operations in 1999. And in 1999 they had a certain tariff, and they submitted that. So after, I think, around 3 years, they went to TAMP and they said that, look, this is our tariff now, you please approve it. So TAMP looked at it and said that, look, we have this principle of cost plus, and you're allowed to have a 16% return, but you have shown this 102 rupees as a part of your cost, and we don't agree with this. So because 102 rupees is something that you have bid, and it should come from a part of your profits, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense to us. I mean, somebody else could have promised 200 rupees and then passed it on to the end user and shown it as a part of their cost. So we don't agree with that. And they said that, look, we actually believe that the tariff that you're charging right now should go down by 50%. Obviously, PSA was not in agreement to that. They went to court, and then that tariff order was stayed by the court. Now, in the meanwhile, of course, private sector brought in a lot of efficiency. The initial construct was that they had to do 300,000 containers at the terminal, and of course they enhanced that, because if they increase the number of containers handled at the port, then you can get more revenues and you can make more profits. But repeatedly, in fact, they kept going back to TAMP, and TAMP kept on saying that, look, the original construct that you had, we can't allow you to have this payment that you are making to the government on a per container basis as a part of your expenditure. And in the end, finally, I think they have just started meeting the bare minimum that they were ready to meet, because otherwise bringing in efficiency gains was not really helping the operator there. The other very similar story is in the JNPT port. So in JNPT port, also when the container terminal was awarded, it was given on the principle of an equity return of 16%. The issue with that is that efficiency gains result in a lower tariff, because most infrastructure business is higher fixed cost and less variable cost. And you can actually, when you do more, your costs don't arise that much, but your denominator, which is the number of containers that you're handling, can actually go up quite significantly, which actually results in a lowering of tariffs, which is completely something which a private sector entity who's operating the port will say that, look, if I'm using my efficiency, increasing the throughput, I should not be penalized for it. But if the regulatory regime is that it is going to be a equity return, then it will actually mathematically result in that. So when you do your regulation, when you have to envisage that in this kind of a situation, is it sustainable or not? So I'll end the section on the port side. But for me, this progression is very interesting, that the government finally took a decision to give the flexibility and the authority to major ports. And my thinking about it is that in the beginning, in 1997, there were only major ports. The non-major ports did not exist. Private sector ports did not exist. There was a monopoly. There was a need from the objective that I just stated of, when there is a monopoly asset, there should not be unfair pricing. So yes, there was a need for a regulator, but now there are enough capacity in our country, and competition itself might ensure that the market forces might ensure that the rates are kept in check. So let us say that in JNPT, which is close to Mumbai, the port operator charges very high. Pipavav is not very far away. Mundra is not very far away. So the cargo owner might say, okay, fine. I mean, if JNPT is being unreasonable in their rates, I'll go to a different port. So because enough assets have been created, now there is a possibility of the government to think of the situation in which you say, okay, you regulate your own price, because now the market will regulate you. You can't really get into a situation in which you charge very, very high. So that was a very interesting journey of the regulator in the port sector. Now coming to power sector. Now I am not a power sector practitioner, so I will narrate this story quickly and fast, but it's a very interesting story for me. So this is about the Tata thermal power plant in the state of Gujarat. So this is in the power plant which is close to the Mundra port, and in 2006 this was kind of bid out and won by this Tata Power, and it was a 4 gigawatts coal-based thermal power plant. It was based on purely getting imported coal, and Tata's also had some tie-ups in Indonesia to get coal at a very cheap price. So on the back of that, they bid very, very aggressively, and they quoted a tariff of 2.26 rupees per unit. And there is something known as this power purchase agreement, which is very essential for a power plant to function. So the states of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Haryana, Rajasthan, Punjab, they had an agreement that they will offtake the power from the power plant, and they'll pay the tariff that is 2.26 rupees per unit. So in 2010, the government of Indonesia suddenly said that, look, all these past contracts that we have given, we will not honor them. The coal has to be sold from our country at the market rate. So even if suppose you have tied up something like $10 per ton for coal in the past, if the current market rate is $40 per ton, then it's going to be $40 per ton. That's it. So now Tata Power's entire business model of quoting 2.26 was based on cheap coal. Now the Indonesian government changed it. Now it completely changes the cost dynamics of that power plant. It resulted in a 3,000 crore per annum revenue loss for them. So when I was reading about this case, Tata Power represented to the CERC, who's the regulator in the power sector, that look, this is a force majeure. This is something that we couldn't have foreseen. This is something that we couldn't have predicted, and it's force majeure. So give us relief under the force majeure, so that there can be a change to the tariff that we had quoted. And that's what has been written in our concession agreement. There is a clause of force majeure. But the CERC ruling was that they disagreed with Tata Power. They said, this is not force majeure. This is a business risk. This is nothing to do with the law of India or the, whatever we had bid out. We have not changed. Nothing has happened in India. Something has happened outside. That was your cost of procurement of raw material, which is coal. That is a business risk. In the concession period, when you quoted 2.26, you should have taken into account the various, the possibilities, sensitivities, what can happen in the future, and then it should have been a conscious, calculated decision. You can't say that the cost of raw material has gone up and therefore, our tariffs should be revised. We don't agree, because this is not force majeure. Nothing has happened in the Indian, in India as a country. Something has happened in your supply chain. We can't accept. But the CERC said that, look, when CERC was formed, it also says in our guidelines, when the objectives of CERC was defined, that CERC's job is also to see to it that the projects are viable. The regulator cannot really insist and ask a private sector on the face of credible and factual information that you please continue to run this even though you are making a loss, because that's just not possible. If someone doesn't take a view, then it will just go into bankruptcy, right? So the CERC did allow an increase in tariff. So again, for me, it was very interesting to note the first point, the point that I made in my first slide, that the regulator here, I saw the regulator playing a role, saying that look, it's about, of course, the tariffs should be competitive for the end user, but it should also be a sustainable business, and that is the one aspect of the regulator that came to the fore in this example, and I personally found that very interesting, and that particular ruling. You guys can also go and read it up, and you will also be able to appreciate this aspect, that the regulator is saying that they recognize that there is something which is unprecedented, making things unsustainable, and therefore we feel that there should be a relook at the tariff that was there at the bid stage. Okay, now we come to the railway sector. Now I belong to the railway sector, and so it's a sector close to my heart. I will speak about something which is not there on the slide, but I think it's very topical these days. A lot of talk about privatization of railway trains, of railway stations, etc., etc. But what I wanted to tell you about is the container train operations. So railways in our country mainly looks at moving coal, iron ore, fertilizers, food grains across the length and breadth of the country. Even during the corona crisis, the freight trains never stopped. The passenger trains were stopped, but the freight trains never stopped. And container market is something which is very different from a normal cargo category like bulk cargo, like coal or iron ore, because containers are fragmented. Coal, you go to a coal mine, you get a large amount of coal there. So one train roughly carries in India 3,000 tons. So you get the full 3,000 tons in just one place. You load the whole train, and then you move it to a power plant where that entire coal is required. So it's very easy to do that. But containers is very difficult. So one container train has 90 containers. And those among those 90, all the 90 containers will not belong to one entity. So you have to aggregate them. You have to have a facility where people will bring their cargo by truck, then you put it into a container. So it's a very different business, and railways very early understood that if they did not create an entity to focus on this business, it will never grow. So they created CONCOR, Container Corporation of India, and Container Corporation in India had done a stellar job. They developed the container market, they brought it to a very good size. But somewhere the government felt that there is only one entity which is doing the container movement by railways, and it's a monopoly situation. So let us bring in private sector as well. So in 2006, the Ministry of Railways came out with a tender, and then they wanted to give licenses to private sector to run container trains across the country, and 16 people took the license, and they invested a lot of money. So the private sector who entered the market in 2006, what did they have to do? They had to invest in a terminal. They had to invest in a train on which the containers will be placed. The containers themselves belong to the shipping lines. So there are very large shipping lines like AP Merlo Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, and all these are very large shipping lines. The containers belong to them, but the container train operators own the trains on which the container is placed, and they also own the facility at which the train will enter, and then it will have a warehouse. Cargo will be brought in there, containers will be loaded, unloaded, handled from there, etc. So that terminal also belongs to the container train operator. So they had to invest in that. So they invested 3,000 crores. And the objective of the government was that to break the monopoly of CONCOR, and that happened. So almost 20% market share they could kind of snatch away from CONCOR. Now, what did they have to pay to the railways? They had to pay something known as haulage charges. So when, let us say, a train goes from Delhi to Mumbai, and the train belongs to the container train operator, the locomotive, the track on which the train will run, the driver of that train, the guard who is on that train, all belongs to the Indian Railways. And because the container train operator is running on railways track, they have to give something known as a haulage charge. Now, the haulage charge was a very large proportion of the costs of a container operator. So that was almost constituting 70 to 75% of the expenditure of the container train operators. Now, here something very interesting happened. So when railways wanted to bring in the private container train operators. Just a status check. Is it going fine, Ipsita? Is it audible? Everything is fine? Are we where
Yes.
are we on time?
Yes, we are. It's audible.
Okay, and where we are on time? Oh, I'm already finished my 45 minutes, is it? So I'll go on maybe for another 5-10 minutes. Fine. So
Sure,
so
sure.
so so what happened is that again the railway container market in our country, as I said to you, the shipping lines own the containers, and there is a lot of movement which happens by railway between a location to a port. So that was the business. But the railway said, look, we want these private sector guys to come in, to whom we are giving the license, to also ensure domestic movement. So from Delhi to Bombay, why doesn't cargo move in a container? It should go on by railways, on by container also. So they wanted that to happen. Now the container guys were also, in 2006, railways came up with a concessional tariff that if you carried cargo in containers, to encourage private sector to come in, they said that, okay, we'll give you a lower rate so that you can beat the road sector and bring cargo to the railway. Okay. So what did some of the container train operators do? They looked at certain cargo which was already moving by railways, but they were not moving in containers. They were moving in the wagons. So for example, iron and steel. Iron and steel was moving in railways, but they were not moving in containers. They were moving in normal wagons, right? So, and because the railways had given them a concession, if somebody moved iron and steel product in a container, it would actually be cheaper than what railways was charging them for wagons. So some of the container operators saw that, and they started looking at customers who moved cargo on containers instead of wagons. Now the railways felt cheated. They felt that, look, we did not bring in the container train operators to take cargo from railway to railway. I mean, the cargo was already going by railways. Now you have converted it to containers just because we gave you a concession. You should have focused on traffic which is going by road. Bring in your innovation and ideas and transfer them from road to rail. But instead of that, you are only reducing the revenues of railways itself. And therefore, railways changed the haulage charge and they brought in commodity-wise tariffs. Now, what happened is that made the complete business unviable. So they brought in this change, and there is a very famous circular. It's called RC05, I think, and it completely because the haulage charge was such a large part of the container train operators' business that and usually these railway things work in a circuit. So if you go from A to B and then you go from B to C, C to D and D to A back, that becomes a circuit, because any leg if you move without cargo, then it is a loss, because if nobody is paying you, so it is unsustainable. So you have to have the circuit and you have to have cargo in all the legs, right? Now suppose railways changed the tariff and they were actually moving something between D to A. Now railways changes the tariff, now D to A becomes infeasible. So the end client says, look, I can't any longer move it in containers. For the container train operator, the entire circuit goes for a toss, because from A to B he has cargo, B to C he has cargo, C to D they have a cargo, but D to A the cargo is now no longer viable. So which means from D to A they have to move the train back in a circuit without having anything, any cargo. So it becomes loss making for them. So there was a lot of hue and cry, and that entire business then became completely loss making. And so here is an example where there was no regulator. Here the Indian Railways, who was the owner of Concor, felt cheated, and they had the full powers to increase the haulage rate, which they did. And the competitor of Concor, which was the private sector operators, had no court where they could go and appeal. They had no authority. They could not go and say, look, this is not fair, and we had invested 3,000 crores of our money into this business, and suddenly midway you're changing the rules. It makes us unviable. How is this fair? And when you don't have a regulator, this is the kind of risk that you have. And now when you look at these private trains, this is what is being talked about now. Government wants 150 private trains to be introduced for passenger side. And everybody, whoever is interested in this, is saying that please have a regulator, because Indian Railways also operates trains, and we are also going to operate of trains. But if tomorrow there is some conflict, at least from the container train operations example, there is at least this precedence that a decision might be taken which goes against the interest of a private sector who is investing money into the private trains. So this is a very great anecdote and story in our country, where if there is no regulator, then what happens? The global railway sector, I will just skip because I think I have burst my time, and I will come to the point about this this small anecdote of this GMR in Delhi. So GMR is the firm which has given us this fantastic Delhi airport. I mean, I remember that some senior partner from America had come in, and at that time Delhi airport was just being inaugurated, and he said that, this is such a fantastic facility and we need more of this in the USA. So the Delhi airport, the Mumbai airport are something that are really, really world class. And I remember, the first time when Delhi airport pictures were coming, I was so, curious, and I was impatient to go to that airport. It's fantastic. I mean, you really feel good that our country has got that kind of an infrastructure, and it was developed by GMR. So GMR had promised 46% share of the revenues that they will get. Now in airports, there are two kinds of revenues. So one is known as aeronautical revenues and non-aeronautical revenues. Aeronautical revenues is paid by the flights for, let us say, parking charges, for use of the runway. So these are all, for use of the belt of where the luggage is conveyed. So there are specific charges which are there. These are called aeronautical revenues, and then there are non-aeronautical revenues, which is all the shops which are there, the duty-free shops. They pay rentals, and if there is commercial land in and around the airport, then the hotels, etc., give rental income. So all that becomes non-aeronautical revenues. Now, GMR had to pay 46% share of all the revenues that they earned. Now, what they did was that all these hotels that you see in the AeroCity side, they told them that you have to give us a refundable security deposit and a non-refundable security deposit, right? So, and now they took a position that this is a security deposit. So this is not a part of our revenue. So why? So we are not going to pay any, revenue share out of this. So what this resulted in is that the government wanted a revenue share. The private sector entity found a way of saying that this is not a revenue share, and this is only a security deposit, and they didn't have to pay the revenue share. So this is also an interesting point. And there was a regulator. AERA is the regulator in the aviation sector in our country, but they are absolutely within the rules in saying that it's not a part of revenue share. You wanted 46% of revenue share, and this is not revenue share. This is a security deposit. So in the latest one, there has been a latest round of bidding of 6 airports, which the Adani Group has won. There, the parameter is no longer revenue share. The parameter for bidding is the revenue per passenger. So there's no question of aeronautical revenues, non-aeronautical revenues, nothing. So they are saying that you tell us how much money will you pay us for each passenger who is handled at the airport, and that is your bid parameter. And whoever gives the maximum amount of money, that person gets the bid. So Adani had quoted, I think, around 170 rupees per passenger, and they won the bid. So this is also very interesting learning that what is your bid parameter, and is there ways and means of getting around it, and how do you then design a parameter which is foolproof, which is not open to any interpretation, which leads to either one of those parties getting an undue benefit which they were not supposed to. So this is also another aspect that you have to keep in mind when you look at regulation. So I think that brings me to the end, and I think I have taken almost an hour now. So that's what I wanted to say. And so just going back before I conclude, I come back to this slide. So make services affordable for users. I think TAMP played that role in every terminal. They kept on hammering down the price, and they said, look, regulatory framework says so much, and they kept on bringing down the price, but it didn't work out. And then finally the TAMP itself has lost its role, and market is now regulating the prices that is going to shipping lines. Ensure that there is no unfair pricing for an asset which is a monopoly. I think again we saw a glimpse of that in the TAMP example. Ensure that parties involved have a sustainable business. This is the Mundra example of Tata Power and how CRC took a view on that. Ensure that there is competition. I think here you see this story and anecdote of this container train operator in railways, where a regulator would have ensured that the competition exists. And just because there is no regulator, there is there is an unfair or there is a situation in which the incumbent operator, the majority operator, who is also the authority for the competition, can levy some charges which puts them out of business. So I think this is what we got to see in all these stories that I've narrated to you. So I'll stop here now.
Thank you, Rajaji. That was a world which is not really very well known to us, because our engagements are while we deal with several issues, and regulation is an important part of what we do. This is, of course, you're privy to information as a because of your hands-on work within the sector. I open the forum to the students. Anything that you would want to ask, Rajaji?
Sir, I want to ask you certain things in regard to the privatization of railway.
Saket, a little louder and more distinct.
Saket, first introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you?
Okay, sir. So I'm Saket, and I'm first year student of Public Policy and Governance at TISS.
Slightly more louder, Saket, and a little more distinct.
Okay, am I audible right now?
Yeah, a little bit. Go on.
Okay, so sir, I'm Saket, and I'm first year student of Public Policy and Governance at TISS Hyderabad. My question pertains to the privatization of railway. Since you're talking about regulation and how more privatization means the prices will be regulated by market mechanism. So don't you think this is going to be not very inclusive development of railway, and the benefit of this thing will not reach to the common people at large?
Yeah. Saket, it's not very clear. Do you mind putting it as a chat message so that we can read it out?
Okay.
So I think I kind of grasp what he's saying. He's saying that do you think that privatization of railways will be good for the end users? Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly. That's my question.
Yeah. So see, I think there are two sides to the coin, and if you look at some of the parameters of our country, the one parameter which you will hear a lot, Saket, is the average speed of our trains. So the average speed of freight trains in our country is supposed to be around 20 kilometers or 25 kilometers per hour. The fastest train that we have in our country is the Shatabdi or the Rajdhani, which is around maximum 160 kilometers per hour. And if all of us travel a lot by trains, generally you will see only two designs in our country. One is the old design, which is belonging to Integral Coach Factory, and then there is another design which you see in this Shatabdi, which is known as the LHB coach design. Okay. As a citizen of our country, you can ask a question: why, since independence for the past 50 years, we have only two designs in coaches? Why is the speed of our trains only 160 kmph when China can have trains of 300 kilometers per hour and Japan can have a Shinkansen? Why can't our country have that? Is it that we don't have the ability to do that? What is the reason for that? So, and one of definitely the reasons for that is that being an entity purely of the government has its own pluses and minuses. But one definite minus is the ability to take a decision. The flexibility that a private sector has in taking decisions, supply chain decisions, and adoption of technology decisions. It's very easy for a private sector to do, but not very difficult for a government to do. So there is a reason why the technology has not changed, because how do you choose a technology? There are so many questions that a government organization needs to consider. So what I would say to you is that, we have to bring in, if you look at this particular side, that why don't I have better technology in my country? Why don't I have advanced things in my country? Some of it will come by introduction of private sector. Now, yes, India, a lot of people, what should I say, are going to be dependent on railways, but that's where I think the regulation has to play a part of where does the government support a public good. Sorry, was I was on mute, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, it's not about privatization of railways. It is more about, certain pockets, certain private sector involvement is being introduced. It's not a wholesale privatization of railways. I don't think that's such an easy thing to do, given the size and complexity of the railway organization in our country. It's not possible to privatize railways as a whole. It's just bits and pieces which is being done.
Right. Are there other questions?
Can I have something?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Rajaji. This is Amit Sadhu Khan, faculty at the School of Public Policy and Governance. This is an interesting lecture for our students who just joined in this course, and I teach economics to them, so I have to take them some of the issues that you have raised in our course. So that's why this lecture could be a good kind of example for me, actually. In connection to this kind of debate you are making, that you, of course, you made a point in the beginning saying that, yes, this is not a kind of theorization, theoretical understanding about the regulations. As we all know, there are two subjects, economics and law, that gives the kind of foundation of the regulation system and so on and so forth. I want to bring one of the reference currently that's is under discussion in the US. As you know, that there is a committee by the judiciary, committee for the judiciary in the US Congress, and that Congress came with a report actually on it's called investigation on the competition in digital economy. Okay, and that's basically taking into account Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, right? So I would request all of our students to go to that report. I can share with them. So that first, say 20, the executive summary of the paper would tell you what is the situation of the regulation, particularly the antitrust institutions, okay? And how is it going to require a new kind of forms of regulations, not only in the digital market that are there, but also at as Rajaji pointed out, that other sectors like infrastructure and so on and so forth. Now, so that's the reference I am just trying to tell them through your forum, through this forum. Second question, actually, it's a discussion when you made a comparison between India and say China.
What was the question in first?
I'm coming. Yeah, I'm coming. I'm coming to the question.
No. You said not second question, so I thought I'll ask the first question.
No. This is exactly the question. First is the reference for our students. Second is basically that theorization on the regulations. Correct. Right. That's one that came in just this month in the US Congress. So that's second question is basically when you are saying that India's rail, take an example of India's rail with China's Shenzhen and of course new bullet train that is about more than 10,000 kilometers long kind of route has been just placed over a decade in China, vis-a-vis comparing India's experience. What would be the reasons for that? In terms of course, you have to start where we are right now in terms of investment priority, development stage, and also the priority on the kind of pricing in terms of who are going to use that, right? Is it something? So I think that perhaps would be good to understand. When you are saying the Shenzhen or the bullet train just started in 2007, most of the things, and right now 10,000 kilometers of track. And of course, the China's, India's case. How do you explain the differences that perhaps would help us either to match that level in a decade or so? And what would be the kind of, I am saying that mostly the economic point perhaps, of course, regulatory point, right? That are having the lag. Because of that, we are not just a kind of reaching to the level China just have done a decade. So what would be that? What is that, regulatory framework fit this fame that would help us to reach to that level? I'm talking about the Shenzhen, by the way. I'm just, sorry, I'm not talking about the Japan's bullet train. I'm talking about the, to some extent, parallel to the bullet train happening in the China. Yeah, thank you for your.
Sure. So I'll just respond to that. So I have been, sometimes when there used to be a railway budget, I used to get invited on some of the channels to give reactions and discuss that. And every year the question will be, ki, when will this change happen in India, etc., etc. So, and by when will railways be able to transform itself? The fact of the matter is that the railways is a humongous organization. It's a huge organization. It's got 13 lakh employees, and it's got 65,000 kilometers of track, and it is kind of a supermarket. It's not. It produces coaches. It produces locomotives. It also has all departments. It has got its own medical function there. It's a mega organization which is there. And this, in the past 5 years, some very drastic changes have been made in the railways, and which for a person like me, who's an ex-railwayman and even an existing railway person, are very shocking. I mean, first of all, nobody would have ever imagined that we are always used to a budget of railways budget coming before the general budget. But that was changed. That was stopped. Now that was a big change. The second thing that was done was that very recently is that the railway board had a certain construct always, and that was changed just 2 weeks back. And the way in which the officers are recruited to the railways is actually aligned by department. So there is a civil engineering department, there is a mechanical engineering department, there is a signaling department. Now that has also been changed. So what I'm trying to kind of get at is that in a democratic country, which is different, politically vis-a-vis a China, where maybe a decision can be forced down, the citizens can be forced down on various organizations, decisions can be taken in a very different style. In India, where there is a democratic institution, where there are so many watchdogs like the CVC and the CBI and all that, and you cannot take arbitrary decisions. You have to take decisions which are, you have the fiduciary responsibility that whatever money you're spending on behalf of the citizens of the country is spent in a equitable manner. It is spent in a manner in which it is fair. There's fair competition. When you have all these objectives in place, and you have to work within those. And I feel that a lot of big changes are happening in the railways. Unfortunately, we will not have the speed as we see in China. That is unfortunately not going to be the case, because our country is a democratic country and it will take time. But I would say that the process has started, and some of these projects, which is a private trains initiative, many people say it's not well thought out, it's been done in a hurry. But my view on that is that you have to try these things. I remember when the dynamic fairs were introduced in Rajdhani, there was this interview that I had given, and people said that why is railways doing this? I said that, look, this is nothing permanent. But if you don't experiment and if you just keep the status quo, you will never learn. That dynamic pricing has been removed later. So the point is that you have to keep trying different things in the market, and the private trains is an initiative. The big organizational changes is an initiative. Right now, there is also a talk about corporatization of the railway production unit. So I think steps are being taken, but we will not see the same speed of as China. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajaji. Krishna, do you want to ask something?
Hi Rajaji, sir. This is Krishna from the School of Public Policy and Governance and Tata Institute of Social Science. And so it was very insightful, and it reminded me of my operational management classes when I have done an assignment on freight information system back then. So my question is that talking about a democratic country and talking about the regulatory body that is there, and now the Vivek Roy committee, they mentioned about the corporatization of the railways. So do you think, what is your opinion, like the regulatory bodies who are working or the players who are working in a certain regulatory body, are they very much technocratic or bureaucratic in their approach, even though they are working towards the customer end, but they are not involving the citizen in the whole decision making process? And my second question, whether the lean management process is viable in Indian scenario comparing to the value mapping system in the freight traffic. Thank you, sir.
Your first question was about whether citizens are being involved or not.
Yes, sir.
And what was the second one? I didn't get the second one.
My second question is related to the lean, whether the lean management is viable in the freight value mapping stream, especially in the loading part, especially in the axle loading part, whether it's viable or not. So basically, my first question is from the perspective of social science, and my second question is from the perspective of the operational management. To clear the question.
So what is valuable? What is viable? I didn't get your question. What?
So whether the lean-based management is possible in the freight traffic or not?
What management? Sorry.
In the freight traffic management, sir.
He's trying to ask if lean management is possible in freight transfer.
E-management.
Lean
management.
Yeah,
lean management.
Yes. So likewise, you pointed it out that again you have to move from A to B and B to C and D, and then when you have to again travel from D to A without any loading, then you are incurring certain losses. So suppose if you have to travel from a point to point B, as per the requirement, as per the demand of a certain infrastructure, then I don't think that it will the Indian Railway will be having a revenue loss.
Okay, I got it. Let me respond and let me try to respond. So the first question is that, see, I think in most regulatory stances, whenever a tariff proposal is put in, it's always put up on public domain. Generally, that is the process. So, it's a question of who is as well informed to be able to comment. The citizens have to be well informed to comment and to understand the nuances. I have been working in this sector for 20 years and I still don't know much about, the nuances of each and every topic. So when a tariff, at least I'm speaking from the infrastructure side of it, I wouldn't be able to comment on the other regulatory spaces like, let us say, financial regulator and RBI, etc. But on the infrastructure side, if it is ERA or it is STAMP, they always put up their proposals in the public domain, and whoever are the relevant users who understand that are always allowed to comment on them. So if you say, are they technocrats? Yes, of course they are technocrats. Can the citizens participate? If the citizens have enough knowledge to be able to say something which is intelligent and relevant, they are absolutely, there is a window of opportunity to do that. That's how the process of a regulator works, because that's the whole beauty of a regulator, that everything is in black and white. I mean, the case which happened in the container train operators, in which the railways just unilaterally changed a haulage tariff, would not have happened if there had been a regulator. What would have happened is that there would have been a meeting, the minutes of the meeting would have been put up on the website of the regulator, and everything would have had to have a view, and there has to be a rationale. It cannot be an irrational decision. That's my response to your first question. My response to your second question is on lean. Can there be a lean process for freight management? And you have talked about A to B in the example that I gave. Now, see, cargo business is very dependent on the availability of cargo. You cannot produce it out of thin air. So if I were to give you a very crude example, suppose you were to run a bus, and suppose you were to run a bus from Delhi to a village somewhere, okay, and from Delhi to that village you get a lot of people who are ready to travel in your bus, but from that village you are not going to get anybody. From that village you want to go to an adjoining village and you want to carry a little bit of people, and from that adjoining village you want to bring it back to Delhi. So the point is that the cargo needs to be available in a transport business. When you are just a courier of either public or of cargo, you are not generating the demand. The demand has to be there. What you do, suppose I had to run a train, and if I were a freight operator, what I would first do is that I will find out where is the cargo moving, between what destination points is the cargo moving. Suppose I know, okay, between let us say somewhere in Jharkhand to Delhi there is a lot of coal movement, then I'll put up a train there. But then I will always think that once my train reaches Delhi, then what do I do with that train? Because the train, carried coal, came to Delhi, unloaded it. Now what do I do? If there is no cargo in Delhi, what do I do? So the railways had a method of initially had a method of mostly paper-based kind of management of freight movements, but now they have a system called FOIS, Freight Operations Information System. So any freight train that is moving today in the country is a part of that system, and that is one way in which they are actually moving train movements and planning for their movements of trains and wagons. So that's my response to your second point.
Thank you so much, sir.
Shreya, and after that, Shrishti.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shreya from the PPG, Public Policy and Governance.
Just a minute. Is it, Rajaji, is it okay with you if we club all the questions so that you can answer it once?
Let's do that. Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. Krishna, lower your hand, please.
So should I go?
Yeah, share word.
So my question is that the private companies entering railways will have to charge fares that are lower than the airfares so that the traffic doesn't go there. And then the fares should be higher than the existing rail fares because they have to provide for the services too. So the profit margin will be low. Then how we are going to incentivize the whole setup for the private companies so that they come and vouch for this?
Okay, is there any other question?
Srishti, I mean, before Srishti says, let me just, read out one question, not read out, just summarize for you, which is in the chat box, where it is said that the experience of privatization of in other countries have not been so pleasant, okay? Specifically, they have, in places like UK, what happened is that they use the public infrastructure and use the rolling stock on that, and that, resulted in some kind of, public disinvestment into the railway system, and leading to reducing the quality of service. Okay, so I mean, these two are related, and we'll take Srishti's question.
Hi, I'm Srishti. I'm from Public Policy of Governance. So my first question was somewhat on the same lines as what Shreya asked. My second question would be that already we are saying that the civil aviation sector is suffering a lot from the fact that it is highly capital intensive, but it has not been able to make that level of profits as was expected initially. And a lot of private companies are suffering due to the competition or the cutthroat competition that's going on in predatory pricing. So how do we ensure that the same thing doesn't get repeated when railways is getting privatized?
Fine. Any other question?
In the chat box, there is another one which says that will privatization lead to cutting off of, so-called unpopular or, routes? Just the way we have seen that apart from Air India, nobody really travels, no other airlines really flies to the northeastern side of the country, something on those lines, I guess.
Also, sir, already the airlines are providing us with some sort of luxury travel at a cheaper at cheaper prices. And meanwhile, the railways at present, they are sometimes they are costing a lot more for the same level of services. So once the private sector enters into the railways, uh, won't they be repeating the same thing that they did with the airlines? However, again, the airlines is already a viable option for a lot of passengers, especially when there is a huge increase in air traffic already. So why would they be shifting to railways at all? Why would the passengers be going back to railways just because it has been privatized? They can very well stick to the airlines.
So, let me try to respond to these points. I think all of them are very interesting and good points. So the first point is that what we have to keep in mind is that the railways pre-COVID was carrying 8.5 billion passengers. And what the entire airlines carry in the whole year is equivalent to 10 days of the traffic that the railways carries. So the numbers that we are talking about are completely disproportionate. So that is the one point that we have to keep in mind. The second point that we have to keep in mind is that we are right now talking about only 150 trains. When in the normal course before COVID, Railways was looking at total 21,000 trains, out of which 14,000 trains were passenger trains. Crisscrossing across the country, and what right now is being talked about is 150 trains. Now, obviously, you know, as I said, that it is not a privatization of railways. It is about bringing in private sector to show the mirror to the incumbent operator. If today you wanted to tell railways that, look, you know, there is a much better level of service which is possible, railways will say, I don't think so. They will say that, you know, we are the best in the whole world, and given the circumstances in India, given the volumes that we carry, given the resources that we have, nobody can do anything better than us. How do you give a reply to that? I think one way of looking at giving a reply to that is to bring in competition and say that, look, there is a way of doing this much more efficiently. And there needs to be, you know, competition always leads to betterment of services. So just 150 trains. It's not that the entire Indian Railways is being privatized. So when you look at who will bid for this and whether they will be able to bring in a price point which is, you know, above railways, below the airlines, I think while the government wants 150 trains to be bid out, the bidders who come in will do a very careful analysis on where is this going to really make sense for them, where, in which combinations of city to city does the traveling people have a paying power. They can bring in efficiencies. So for example, they can bring in efficiencies in their costs of maintenance. It's no surprise to anyone that the costs that the Indian Railways incurs is much higher than what would actually need to be incurred, and they might bring efficiency into that. They might bring efficiency into bringing in a technology which can actually run faster. So I can tell you an anecdote of a company called Talgo, TALGO. You can look it up and you can read the anecdote. Talgo is a Spanish company, and a very curious fact is that they also have the same gauge. There is a word known as gauge in the railways, that is basically the distance between the railway line. So the distance between the railway line in our country is 1676 millimeter. All across the world, in most countries, the distance between the rails is 1435 millimeters. But in our country, it's 1676 millimeters. And Spain is another country which actually has that 1676 millimeter wala track. And this company said that, look, we have a different design. You don't need to do any changes to your track. We will bring our train, and between Delhi to Mumbai, our train will be able to run 2 hours lesser time than your train. And the railway said, no, we don't believe you, and we don't agree with you. They said, at our cost, we will bring the train from Spain. We will run it here. You use your locomotive only. You use your track only. And we will prove it to you. So they did that at their own cost. They brought their train from Spain. and they ran it here, and they actually shaved off 2 hours because the technology of their bogie is different. So it could actually run faster, even in our own track. So those are the kind of innovations they will bring. They will try to sweat, the term that we use, to sweat the asset. They will get more money out of the same asset, which a government agency will not be actually motivated to do. But a private agency will think of, how do I use this asset better? How can I use the turns better? How can I, use any spare time to get more revenues? That's the innovation that a private sector will bring. Coming to the point about UK. Now, UK is a very, very interesting example. And I think that is an example. And I was just sharing with somebody that UK, which is always the example given on privatization of railways, has now not privatized, has brought railways into the public sector, and India is going the other way around. So again, the response that I have here is that the regulatory regime has to be an ever evolving regime. It cannot be a static thing. I mean, if you look at the port sector, the TAMP was formed, and then TAMP was kind of not given it, the powers were taken away. So in practical life, when the government, as as someone who's governing the country, they have to have a view of how the sector is working. Does it need a regulator? Does it not need a regulator? In United States of America, there is no strong regulation for railways. There's no regulator. So the private sector firms own the railways there, and it is all self-governed because of market forces. So it's very light touch regulation. So one railway in US was light touch regulation. Another developed country in UK had really, really strong regulation. Now they have not done away with the regulation. So it is always a journey. The response that I will give to you on, that the services were not good, the ticket prices were going high, it has had a repercussion here. And the last point I would want to respond is on somebody saying that, what if the companies, didn't do well, and in the airline sector, if they are not able to sustain, and if they are going to go out of the market because of the COVID situation, there's so much of competition there. So here I would say that some businesses have to, when somebody kind of opens an initiative, they have to take a certain view of the market. Now, I don't think that whether the business is run profitably, not run profitably, is something that a single regulator can influence. The regulator can see to it that some of the factors are there which is conducive and the businesses are sustainable. But how a company chooses to run itself is something that the regulator cannot control. If Kingfisher has gone bankrupt for certain policies, you cannot blame the regulatory environment. I mean, it's also a factor about how that company is actually run. Is it a well-run company? There is a reason why Indigo has got the maximum market share, and there's a certain business model that works. So I think just the regulatory environment will not ensure that there is sustainable business. I think the people who are going to enter the market have to have a sustainable business model given a certain regulatory environment. Have I kind of responded to everything, or did I miss out on anything?
I think you have responded to everything. I just wanted to flag, Rajaji, that you are not the only person who is so much passionate about railways. See, this whole discussion was hijacked by railways itself.
That's true.
So everybody was so passionate about railways. They can't see whether they travel or they don't travel. There's some emotional attachment of Indians to the railways.
That's true.
The very fact that what I've thought, because my understanding, what you were trying to educate us with, which you did very nicely, is about the regulatory deficits which occur in various formats, whether there is no regulation or there is a regulation. There are certain institutional designs which bring a certain kind of slack in the system. And how can we actually address them? That's the basic message which I was trying to think. But I guess because of this fascination for Indian railways, the talk only was restricted to railways. I just, if you give me the liberty, I just want to understand something. It's not a question. It's just I want to understand something. See, there's a particular regulatory design about tariffs, about pricing, and so on and so forth. And we mostly find in most of the sectors, I'm not talking about any particular sector, many of the sectors will find that midway during the process, we find that design is turning out to be unsustainable. And then there is a renegotiation. Is it, well, I, as sitting as an outsider, I always find that this whole process is by design. That you set the tariff so high, you set the business model so unsustainable that the private sector has no other option but to renegotiate with you. First, they make a space for entry and then they renegotiate the profit. And I'm not very sure whether at this renegotiation, whether all the information which is transparent. So how do we curb this process? If we have to think about regulation, if we think about a robust kind of a institutional mechanism where government is not solely, there's a third party regulation, which I want to say, between the government and the private player, and that this renegotiation is very transparent. I'm not sure whether I'm able to push my point very clearly.
No, you are. I'm just thinking about it. See, I think that, I do not know, another point popped up into my head. I was just having this conversation with someone in the National Highway, National High-Speed Rail Industrial Corporation.
Okay.
And I'll come to the point, but I just wanted to kind of narrate this because it just popped into my head. They said that, look, Japan, the culture is different. I mean, in Japan, if some supplier gave you a defective product, the supplier themselves will maybe reach out to the end customer to whom they have given the defective product, and they will say that, look, we have given you a defective product, we want to recall it, and we want to give you the right product. I mean, that's the culture of that country. But in our country, increasingly the point that you're mentioning, that somebody bids for it and बाद में देख लेंगे वाला जो concept है कि we will see, we'll manage it sometime later. And that's why many a times whenever there is a bid in India in the infrastructure sector, many people from outside do not want to bid for it without an Indian partner, because in the Indian side, they always know that certain things are not, it's not a very mature system in which everybody is very well educated and everybody knows comprehensively all the sides and aspects. Is not very well thought out. Even right now, there's a lot of pressure that complete the PPP initiative in the railways within this year, etc., etc. There is always a pressure on that, and that pressure sometimes leads to does not lead to the right homework being done to think through each and every possibility and to build for it. So that is something that is there, and I do not have a reply on what can be done to do this. But I would say the only other comment which is coming to my mind is that India somehow is not afraid to experiment. I think I kind of take it in a very positive way. So if you look at the road sector, it first started off as an annuity model. Then it went annuity model, meaning that somebody will spend in making the road, and then they'll get every year they'll get some money. So they did not have to bother about how many buses or cars will run on the road. That went on for some time. Then the government felt that, okay, let us do it on a toll model, that I will not take the risk, I will not take the responsibility of giving this every year money to this developer. Let the developer only build the road and let the developer also collect the money. So to win those projects, people started bidding very aggressively. And when the 2008 crisis happened, and then they found that the traffic was not to the level that it was there, then they started getting into a situation in which they couldn't pay back the loan of the banks. Then the government came up with a hybrid annuity design. So they said, okay, fine, you put in 60% of the money, 40% I will give you, and I will also not, the annuity is something that I will pay you. So they came up with a hybrid model. The point I'm trying to make to you is that in India, I definitely see that there is a process of learning. So yes, you bring out a certain method. Now that method goes a certain way, and maybe the players involved try to go and renegotiate. Sometimes they're able to, sometimes they're not able to. I mean, the example that I gave you about Tuticorin Port, Port Authority of Singapore Authority is a good entity, but they couldn't negotiate with DAM. And TAM stood by its ground and they said, no, this is what it is. And the government had to find a regulatory answer to that. They couldn't fix a contract which they had already entered into. And they had to really change the regulation. So this progression of evolution of regulation, in my view, as an infrastructure practitioner, is a great one, because fine, maybe you were not great that you could think of all possibilities and came out with a construct which took care of all eventualities, but you are learning in the process. So maybe now if somebody brings in a regulation in ports, they will be much more aware of what has happened in the history, and then they will be able to think of something. So we are also going through that process of learning. Actually, India has done a lot in public-private partnership in ports, and we have a lot of rich experience behind us. So maybe we'll get it right in some time.
I'm just curious to ask one more thing, and I want to pick your brains on. See, in the current COVID situation, with the huge amount of lockdown and less traffic, the tolls which the private operators should have collected, they have drastically come down. And it hurts the viability of that particular model itself. What extent the state can step in, and should the state step in or not?
So, see, should the state step in? My answer to it would be yes. Will it be allowed to step in? Very difficult, because again, as a concept, when you look at it, it looks very logical. But when it comes down to execution, there is a certain person at a certain role who has to sign a paper. And the systems in our country, do they enable that, or do they not enable that, is a question you have to worry about. Tomorrow, if suppose there was an XYZ player on a certain road stretch of 100 kilometers who was taking collecting toll, his revenue has fallen down to 10% of his original. He's saying my business is unviable. He puts up a proposal to the government, give me 50% support. Somebody has to sign that paper. Who will sign that paper? Suppose somebody says later that you have only signed that paper because he gave you a kickback. That's why you're signing it. And these kind of worries are real in our country. The officers on the state government side who are going to sign the document, these are natural points that they have to worry about. So these points usually is kind of kicked up and said, okay, chief minister or the prime minister's office only will sign. In fact, the other anecdote popping into my head is that why in our country the lockdown and the release of the lockdown and opening of the country, why was everybody looking at the prime minister's office? Why was every state not taking a local decision? Because again, the problem is that the structure of a country, the government, institutions, etc., there is a huge price to pay if your decision goes wrong on paper. And at the end of the day, that person is a bureaucrat, right? So how do you enable a system in which a person who's taking a bold decision is not hounded? So my answer to your question is that yes, it should be, but on paper, how it will happen in the current system is very difficult.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think we have, completely, gone beyond the time that we thought we would restrict this to, and ask several questions. And I think, as Professor Aseem has pointed out, that the moment you talk about railway and privatization, people start feeling very uncomfortable. No, aisa nahi kar sakte kind of thing. Thank you very much, Rajaji. May I just request Dr. Arvind Pandey to to please deliver a vote of thanks, please.
So yeah, it was very enriching discussion, I would say, and it would not have been much better to listen someone who has a first-hand experience. All these anecdotes really comes from if it comes from the person who has a length of experience in different sector itself. And the question which you have posed about the roles of regulators, the 4 questions, I would really think that it would help our students to further rethink about whether what kind of roles regulator could play. And obviously the discussion and the question answer session which we had mainly related to the privatization of railway would definitely benefit our students. And on behalf of TISS, I would like to thank to Rajaji for this, just giving this time to us and having this enriched discussion. And also I would like to thank my prospective team who have really, they always make effort to make this perspective successful. So yeah, from TIS Hyderabad and school, I hope that in future also we would like to have discussion, engagement, debate with you. And I hope that you would also give us time in future also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before everybody leaves, may I ask the student to stay back?
Okay.
And one more thing I wanted to say that, on our behalf is that we are always in an echo chamber where, we hear people who are from similar backgrounds and, who theorize about these things, which is important, but it is also important for us to get out of the echo chamber and to listen to, practitioners and understand, where they come from. I think that makes the debate all the more, valuable. Thank you very much, Rajaji.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. The first year students, I just want to have a conversation with first year students if they are there. Yes, so unlike Rajaji, if possible, I'm a bit more particular. If possible, please switch on your video wherever it is. Yeah. So, see, the point is that there are 2-3 things I want to talk about. One is this team which was there has been constituted for the case law. क्या बोलते हैं आप लोग? Case competition.
Yes, sir. Case studies competition.
Who are those people?
Sir, there are 7-8 people in the group.
So
including
just think about one idea is that, see, your course I will try to finish up by 7th of November. Okay, because that's where the second year goes. Well, the second year will go away. Okay, because you're sharing that course with them. So you will have some time beyond. When is your course getting over?
28.
28. Okay. So first thing we may think of designing a case competition for ethics and public action. Okay, where you can bring up policy case studies. I have ideas, but I don't want to share it now. But you have to think about it. How will you design a case competition on ethics and public action? So, and then we can write to the office of chairperson to get some money for it, where we can have some prizes and all also through across country, internationally, wherever you want to do it. But think about an idea that if ethics and public action in a very concrete ways, and by the time we will do many other things also, we will by November, Dr. Khushbu Srivastava will be of immense if she has time, because she has the considerable experience in studying and researching political theory also. So if she could be of immense help also, if you can think about it. And we have to talk to her about how much time she has and what kind of role she can do it. So that is be a good thing. But try and design something on this, because this will be a very unusual kind of, normally this is they will solve a policy problem, bijli aa rahi hai ki nahi aa rahi hai. Cases are normally like that. And one course which you will do, which I think I will request at some point of time for Khushbu to also speak on that. We do a particular theme, Khushbu, what money can't buy. We basically take up surrogacy as one of the case studies there. So perhaps you may also like to speak on that, if provided you have time at some point of time. So so anyway, so think about it, that how can you frame a case competition around ethics in public action.
Sir, I just wanted to ask you a few things. Since we will need a lot of case studies, so do we have to frame case studies on our own, like the core committee members?
अरे बाबा तू पहले सोचो स्ट्रक्चर क्या होगा, हम सब बता देंगे, अभी तो तुम लोग क्या करोगे, हम केस भी बना के दे देंगे.
ठीक, नहीं वो
तुम सोचो भैया, ethics is there in table also.
Okay.
If you put a simple table, there is a question of ethics there also. Think innovatively, we should attract the person to participate in your competition.
Okay.
Don't come with a case study giving there's a electricity supply, so much money was invested, so much wire was stolen, so what now? Don't give all this kind of case study.
Okay.
The other thing which I really want to alert all of you, like today's lecture, it was a very good opportunity, but I guess you are in the first year, so we didn't expect so much. Try and capture the crux what the author is trying to argue. And he ended with that also one slide which he tries to show what is the 4 points he's trying to flag. So your question should be engaging with that. But anyways, that's fine. I'm not saying questions are very good. Whatever we asked, they were all very good questions. I'm not saying that. So, okay, anything you have to ask?
Sir, I've actually asked all the core committee members to frame one structure of their own, and then we are going to have a meeting on Saturday, and then we will
make it very flat. Why are you asking? Why are they not be joined? I have asked.
No. Everyone is doing that.
So say that.
Everyone is doing that.
So say that.
Including me. Yes, sir.
So say that all of us have decided to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so see this period between, so we will have classes anyway. So this period between, and we should take it in the first week of, we should be prepared. Think about it. We will frame it in November. And we can circulate by mid-November to all universities, schools, and local, nationally and internationally. I think Tony's not here. He has most of the email IDs for both nationally and internationally. So we can some kind of, it can, and what I'm trying to just flag to all of you, that see, ethics is not generally high theory. This is what I'm trying to say. There's a question of ethics in each and everything. There's a question of ethics in a simple table also. So think about it. Yes. Ipsita, you want to say something here?
No, I don't have anything to say here.
Sure.
Asim sir, do we have EPA class tomorrow morning, 9 to 10?
No, I can't do that. Well, next week we'll see.
Okay.
No, not tomorrow. Okay, chalo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.